Hey guys, tonight we're pulling back the curtains on the strange, scratchy, lipstick-scented world of love during the Second World War. Picture a young woman in 1943 standing in a dim parlor while her mother inspects her hemline. She doesn't know it yet, but love itself has been rationed. Settle in. Before you get comfortable, take a second to like and subscribe. But only if you actually enjoy this. If your eyes are already heavy, leave a quiet little like before they close, and know that you're helping more sleepers find these slow, strange history stories in the dark. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is. I love reading them in the morning. Dim those lights, switch on a fan, pull your blanket up, get comfortable. Unlike the chaperoned girls we'll be meeting tonight, nobody is going to inspect your hemline before you drift off. Soften your jaw. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Let the small muscles around your eyes go quiet. Breathe in slowly through your nose for 4 and out gently through your mouth for 6. There is nothing to remember tonight, nothing to learn, nothing required of you. This story is over 2 hours long, so there is no rush and no wrong place to drift in and out. The narration will carry you. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what it really felt like to fall in love when the whole world was on fire? What it felt like to meet a stranger in a crowded canteen, knowing he'd be shipped out by Friday, knowing you might never see him again, knowing your mother would want his last name, his religion, and the exact shade of his uniform before she'd let you write him back? What if a first date required written permission from a priest? What if the government printed a booklet telling teenage girls exactly how many times they could dance with the same soldier before it became unpatriotic? What if the United States Army kept quiet little files on which British girls its soldiers were kissing and what those girls' fathers did for a living? What if a young woman in Birmingham could be arrested on the street simply for walking too close to an American airbase after sundown? What if a mother could refuse a marriage not because the boy was unkind, not because he was poor, but because his khaki was the wrong shade of khaki? What if your love letters were opened, read, and censored by strangers in black sleeves before they ever reached the boy at the front, and sometimes quietly rewritten? What if dancing cheek to cheek was considered a small act of treason? What if a nightclub in Times Square charged soldiers half price, but only if they brought a respectable girl? And what on earth did respectable mean in 1942? And what if, somehow, a man could be court-martialed, his whole career ended, for proposing to the wrong woman in the wrong country on the wrong afternoon? Tonight, slowly, softly, we're going to wander through all of these questions, and more. But first, close your eyes for just a moment, and let me take you there. Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1943. The air smells of coal smoke and braille cream, of wet wool and cheap pomade, and someone's mother's rosewater. Somewhere down the hall, a Bakelite radio is crackling through Glenn Miller's In the Mood, and you can hear heels clicking across a blackout darkened pavement outside. A watered-down gin and orange sweats on a tabletop beside you. You are wearing something itchy, seamed, and slightly damp. Your lipstick, absurdly, is called Victory Red. Step through the curtain. 1944, 1943, 1942, 1941, 1940, 1939. Until the laughter spilling out of a USO canteen in Times Square is the loudest sound in your world. good luck. But before we step through the doors of that canteen, before we let the music and the uniforms and the strange, feverish rules of wartime love wash over us, we have to take one quiet step backward. Because to understand why the world of 1943 was so strange, you have to understand the world of 1938, the one just behind it. The one whose rules were about to be broken. So, let's slip out of Times Square for a moment. Let the laughter fade. Let the trumpets grow distant. And let yourself settle, instead, into a front parlor in a small American town in the late 1930s. Or a terraced sitting room in a northern English mill city. Or a farmhouse on the Canadian prairie. Or a flat above a tailor's shop in Brooklyn. Wherever you happen to be listening from tonight, imagine the version of that place your great-grandmother might have recognized. The parlor is small. The wallpaper has roses on it, faded at the top where the gaslight used to burn. There is a doily on every flat surface, because in the late 1930s the doily was still, somehow, a structural part of civilization. A clock ticks on the mantel. A piano, slightly out of tune, sits in the corner draped with a shawl. And in the best armchair, knitting without appearing to look at her hands, sits your mother. This, my friend, is where courtship happened. Because in the world just before the war, a young man who wanted to spend time with a young woman did not take her out. He came in. The polite, proper American term for it was calling, and it was a ritual as carefully choreographed as a minuet. A young man would be invited, either by the girl or more often by her mother, to call on a specific evening. He arrived in a clean collar, with his hair combed flat and damp, carrying perhaps a small bunch of flowers or a tin of cookies for the family. He was seated in the parlor. He was given lemonade in summer and tea in winter, in a cup so thin you could almost see his fingers through it. And then, under the watchful eye of the mother who had not, in fact, stopped knitting, he attempted to be charming. If this sounds unbearable, it was supposed to. That was the point. Calling was not designed for the young people. Calling was designed for the young people's parents, who wanted to know exactly who was in the house, at what hour, drinking whose lemonade, and when he was going home. But by the late 1930s, calling was already on its way out. It had been dying, quietly, for about 20 years. The culprit was the automobile, the motion picture, the soda fountain, and the simple, irresistible American invention of having somewhere better to be. A new word had taken its place, a word that, believe it or not, had to be explained to older Americans when it first appeared in the 1920s. That word was dating. In 1937, a sociologist named Willard Waller published a paper that has haunted scholars of courtship ever since. He called it the rating and dating complex. Waller had been watching college campuses, Penn State in particular, and what he saw did not look to him like romance at all. It looked like a marketplace. Young men and young women, he wrote, were dating not to find a spouse, not even really to find love, but to climb a social ladder. A Class A man dated a Class A woman. A Class B man did not dare ask. Desirability was measured in fraternity pins, in cars, in dance cards, in the number of phone calls a girl received on a Wednesday evening. Waller used the word thrill a great deal, and he did not mean it kindly. He was, it must be said, a little grumpy about it. But he was also, in his grumpy way, right. Something had shifted. Young people were no longer being evaluated by their parents. They were being evaluated by each other, and the currency was visibility, This new dating world had its own economy, and that economy was brutal. A young man was expected to pay for the movie, for the milkshake, for the streetcar home, for the corsage, for the ice cream sundae split down the middle with 2 long spoons. In the middle of the Great Depression, this was not a small thing. Many young people, frankly, could not afford to court at all. Engagements stretched for years. 3, 4, 7, 9 years was not unusual, because no one could scrape together a down payment on a household. There are letters from the 1930s of couples still writing dearest to each other after a decade of being stuck. And into this economy came a set of rules so specific, so unwritten, and so universally understood that every teenage girl in America could have recited them in her sleep. A girl did not telephone a boy, ever. Not to ask him out, not to confirm plans, not to say thank you for the movies, not even to tell him her cat had died. If she needed to reach him, she waited. If he didn't call, she had her answer. A girl did not pay for her own ticket. A girl did not walk into a restaurant alone and choose her own booth. A girl did not, under any circumstance, suggest where to go on a date. That was his job, and if he chose badly, that was useful information. A girl did not let a boy walk her all the way up to her front door on the first date. She stopped him at the gate or the porch because the door belonged to her father, and her father had opinions. A girl did not kiss on the first date. She did not, in most circles, kiss on the second. By the third, if she liked him, she might allow what the etiquette books called, with genuinely remarkable euphemism, a modest token. And even then, only if the porch light was on. The porch light, you must understand, was not for her safety. The porch light was so the neighbors could see. There was a whole vocabulary for all of this, and it was richer and more specific than anything we have today. A girl and boy who were serious but not engaged were going steady. A boy who gave his girl his fraternity or school pin to wear on her sweater had pinned her, and this was understood by everyone on campus as a kind of pre-engagement, a trial run with jewelry. A couple might be stepping out, which was casual, or keeping company, which was more serious, or sweet on each other, which was the sweetest of all, and meant it was probably too soon to say out loud. What's lovely and a little heartbreaking about these words is that they were precise. They told you exactly where you stood. Today we have to ask, with a kind of modern agony, what are we? And in 1938 there was simply a word for it, and everyone knew which word. Now, here's the wrinkle. Parents in the late 1930s were not actually thrilled about going steady. In fact, most of the advice columns of the era disapproved of it. They wanted their daughters to play the field. A girl who was seen at the soda fountain with 3 different boys over 3 consecutive Fridays was not, in 1938, considered loose. She was considered popular, which was a compliment, and she was considered wise, which was a bigger one. Her mother would brag about it at church. The worst thing a girl could do, in the eyes of an ambitious 1930s mother, was to attach herself too early to one boy, especially one without prospects, and miss the better boy who might have come along in October. So the rules were strict, but the goal was not monogamy. The goal was the market. The goal was to be chosen from a large pool by the best possible chooser. And the whole thing was overseen, gently but inflexibly, by the mothers of America, who read advice columns, compared notes at bridge club, and knew, down to the dollar, what every boy on the block's father earned. There were uniforms for all of this, by the way. A young woman did not leave the house without a hat, not for any occasion more formal than fetching the milk, and gloves were considered basic equipment. Her stockings had seams up the back, and if the seams were crooked, she was spoken about. Her dress hem sat squarely at the knee or just below, and her mother, like the mother in our parlour, might well inspect that hem before she left for the evening, tugging at it, smoothing it, occasionally biting off a thread with her teeth. The boys wore wool suits in summer because they did not have summer suits, and their ties were wide, and their shoes were shined, and their hair was plastered flat with a petroleum product so aggressive that in 1938 you could buy Brile cream in tins the size of small cakes. As for where all this dating actually happened, it happened at the drugstore, where a chocolate soda cost a nickel and a seat at the counter was the social equivalent of a throne. It happened at the movie palace, the one with the velvet seats and the organ that played before the newsreel. It happened at church socials, where the Lutherans and the Methodists competed, quietly but ferociously, to produce the best pie. It happened at barn dances in the countryside, where someone's uncle played fiddle and someone's aunt watched the punch bowl with the eye of a lighthouse keeper. It happened at high school proms, which, please remember this, was still chaperoned in 1939. There was a teacher at the door. There were teachers at the punch bowl. There were teachers, I am not making this up, stationed in the hallway with flashlights in case anyone wandered off to, as the phrase went, get some air. And looming over every one of these dates, every soda, every slow dance, every kiss on every porch in every small town, was a single, strange, all-powerful document, the Hays Code, officially known as the Motion Picture Production Code, enforced from 1934 onward. The Hays Code was the agreement by which Hollywood voluntarily scrubbed its films of anything that might scare a Methodist. It decreed that even married couples on screen had to sleep in twin beds. It decreed that a kiss could last no longer than 3 seconds. It decreed that if a man and woman were kissing on a couch, at least one of his feet had to remain on the floor at all times, a rule that produced some truly spectacular acrobatics in the romantic comedies of the 1930s. And so, an entire generation of young Americans learned how to kiss by watching people who, by federal-ish decree, were barely allowed to kiss. They imitated what they saw. They tilted their heads the way Clark Gable tilted his. They closed their eyes the way Myrna Loy closed hers. They counted, somewhere in the backs of their minds, to 3. There was one single, glorious exception to all of this. One day, a year when the script flipped entirely. In 1937, a cartoonist named Al Capp introduced a storyline in his comic strip Lil Abner, in which the unmarried women of the fictional town of Dogpatch were allowed, for one afternoon, to chase the unmarried men. If they caught one, they could marry him. The strip was a smash hit. Within 2 years, real American colleges were hosting real Sadie Hawkins Day dances, on which, for one bizarre, permitted evening, the girls asked the boys. They paid for the sodas. They pinned the corsages. They walked the boys home. The fact that this had to be invented, and that it only applied to 1 day a year, tells you everything you need to know about the other 364. So that, more or less, was the world. A world of parlors and porch lights, of chaperoned proms and knee-length hems, of fraternity pins and 3-second kisses, and mothers who noted every phone call in a mental ledger. A world in which a girl did not call, did not pay, did not ask, did not kiss, and above all, did not rush. A world whose rules, however strange, however stifling, at least had the dignity of being consistent. Everyone knew them. Everyone, more or less, followed them. And a girl in 1938, leaning on her porch rail watching a boy walk away down a gaslit street, could feel quietly sure that she understood what was happening to her heart. And then, on the 1st of September in 1939, a long line of German tanks rolled over the Polish border. And somewhere between that morning and the next 6 years, 8 million young American men would pull on a uniform, board a ship, and go to meet women whose rules, whose languages, whose mothers, whose porch lights were entirely different. And every single one of the rules we just laid out, every porch light ritual and 3-second kiss and knee-length hem and chaperoned prom and Sadie Hawkins reversal was about to be stretched, bent, broken, or quietly rewritten. The rulebook, as it turned out, was about to get much bigger. Much bigger. Because the moment the war began, and certainly by the time America itself entered it in December of 1941, something extraordinary happened to the printed word in the English-speaking world. It began, quietly at first, and then in a kind of flood, to tell young people how to love. Pamphlets arrived, booklets appeared, magazine columns expanded from 1 page to 3. Sunday supplements devoted entire sections to the proper behavior of young women in the presence of young men in uniform. Church bulletins, which had once limited themselves to bake sales and prayer schedules, began printing advice on appropriate dancing distances. Radio programs added romantic etiquette segments. The YWCA produced booklets. The Red Cross produced booklets. The Catholic Youth Organization produced booklets. Even, somehow, the United States Department of Agriculture produced a booklet, though what the Department of Agriculture had to say about kissing remains, to this day, one of the gentler mysteries of the war. If you had walked into any drugstore in America in 1942 and stood at the magazine rack, you would have seen a dozen different publications all offering, on their covers, some version of the same promise. We will tell you how to behave. We will tell you how to dress, how to speak, how to dance, how to write letters, how to say goodbye, and how, above all, to remain respectable while the world sets itself on fire. The queen mother of all of this, of course, was Emily Post. Her book, Etiquette, first published in 1922, had already gone through multiple editions and sold millions of copies. And during the war years, it was revised and expanded to address what she called, with great dignity, the wartime situation. Mrs. Post added sections on how to address an officer at a dance, how to decline a soldier's invitation without giving offense, how to write a letter of sympathy to a widow of your own age, and, in one absolutely remarkable passage, the proper way to politely disentangle oneself from a serviceman who had, as she put it, pressed his enthusiasm beyond what the situation required. Emily Post was 68 years old when Pearl Harbor was bombed, and she spent the rest of the war writing patient, ironclad instructions on how to be decent during the indecent. Beside her, on every shelf, stood the teen advice books. In 1940, a slim little volume called Dating Do's and Don'ts appeared, aimed at high school girls, and it laid out with frightening specificity the rules of engagement. Never telephone a boy first. Never accept a date offered less than 3 days in advance. To do so would be, and I quote, a confession of social poverty. Never, ever accept 2 dates in one evening, even if the first boy cancelled. Never dance more than 3 dances with the same partner at a school function. Never, at any function whatsoever, be seen stepping outside for air with a boy you had not been formally introduced to. And, this is my favourite, never, under any circumstances, laugh more loudly than any other girl in the room. There was, it seems, a volume limit on feminine joy. Good Housekeeping, Mademoiselle, Parents' Magazine, Ladies' Home Journal. Every one of them ran monthly columns on wartime courtship. Mademoiselle specialised in pieces with titles like How to Behave Around a Serviceman and What to Wear to the Canteen. Good Housekeeping addressed the slightly older demographic, offering advice to war brides and fiancés about setting up a household on a serviceman's allotment check. Parents' Magazine, in a move that tells you everything about the era, addressed its columns not to the young women themselves, but to their mothers, under the assumption that the mother was the one who would actually enforce the rules. Ladies' Home Journal had perhaps the single most influential voice in the genre, a woman named Elizabeth Woodward, who wrote the sub-deb column aimed at teenage girls. Teenage girls wrote to Miss Woodward by the sackful confessing crushes, asking whether they could wear lipstick to a Thursday night dance, wondering if they should write to the soldier they had met at their cousin's wedding. Miss Woodward answered with a kind of cheerful stainless steel certainty. She told one girl that yes, she could write to the soldier, but only 1 letter a week, and never on scented paper, because perfume on paper was a cheap signal. She told another girl that if a boy had not kissed her by the 4th date, she was probably boring him, which is the kind of advice that, read today, makes you want to reach back through time and buy that child a milkshake. And then, above and around and beneath all of this consumer advice, there were the government pamphlets. The actual officially produced taxpayer-funded pamphlets of the United States government telling American girls how to date. The Office of War Information produced them. The War Department produced them. The Public Health Service produced them. The Office of Civilian Defense, for reasons that remain slightly unclear, also produced them. A 1943 pamphlet titled, "I Promise You This Is Real, Keep 'em Flying. But Let Them Fly Alone," warned young women against distracting airmen with too much romantic attention before a mission. A young woman, the pamphlet explained, might mean well, but if her pilot was thinking about her curls instead of his cockpit, she might be responsible for the loss of an aircraft. No pressure. This is where things began to get, frankly, strange. Because the same government that printed "Keep 'em Flying, but Let Them Fly Alone" was also printing posters of Betty Grable in a white bathing suit, looking coyly over her shoulder, and distributing them by the million to barracks around the world. The government wanted its soldiers to have sweethearts. It wanted them to have pin-ups. It wanted them to have letters from home and photographs of girls in cardigans and the promise of a kiss on a porch when they came back. But it did not, under any circumstances, want them distracted, entangled, disease-ridden, emotionally devastated, or, heaven forbid, married to the wrong person. The government wanted romance without romance. It wanted tenderness without consequence. It wanted millions of young men to fight for the idea of a girl back home without actually getting too attached to any specific one. Which is a contradiction so complete that the only way to hold it together was with paper. An ocean of paper. Pamphlets, booklets, posters, radio scripts, magazine columns, church bulletins, all saying, with slight variations, the same impossible thing. Be warm, but not too warm. Be friendly, but not too friendly. Be patriotic, but not, God help us, a patriotute. That word, by the way, is real. Patriotute. Patriot plus prostitute. We'll come back to it. It deserves a chapter of its own. Alongside the patriotute came her cousin, the khaki-wacky. Khaki-wacky was the approved magazine slang for a young woman considered excessively infatuated with men in uniform. Mademoiselle used the term. Ladies' Home Journal used the term. A khaki-wacky girl was one who couldn't, as the columnists put it, distinguish between the man and the uniform. She swooned at epaulets. She giggled at privates. She wrote to 3 soldiers at once and told each of them he was her only. She was to be pitied, gently disapproved of, and quietly avoided. No nice girl wanted to be called khaki-wacky. No nice girl's mother wanted to see her daughter called khaki-wacky in print. And yet, if you think about it for even 10 seconds, half the posters the government was producing were essentially designed to turn every girl in America into a khaki-wacky. The uniform was the whole point. The uniform was the sales pitch. The uniform was why Betty Grable's pin-up cost the government nothing. It was recruitment by proxy. Now, if that wasn't enough contradiction for you, enter the American Social Hygiene Association. ASHA, as it was known, was a private-public partnership dedicated officially to the prevention of venereal disease. Unofficially, it was in the business of scaring the daylights out of every young woman in the United States. During the war years, ASHA distributed millions, actual millions, of pamphlets and posters with titles like "She May Look Clean." But and jukebox, romance can't replace the real thing. One famous poster showed a smiling young woman with neatly curled hair and a string of pearls over the caption, "She may look clean, but pickups, good time girls, prostitutes may look okay, but they can spread syphilis and gonorrhea." The poster was plastered in train stations, in barracks, in USO men's rooms, and in the waiting areas of draft boards. So you can imagine the lived experience of a 19-year-old girl in 1943 walking to the train station to meet her fiancé on his 48-hour pass. She has read, that morning, a Mademoiselle column on how to greet a serviceman at a station. She has her hair set the way good housekeeping recommended. Her lipstick is the approved shade, not too red. She is not wearing perfume on her letters or her throat because Elizabeth Woodward said perfume was cheap. She is not laughing too loudly because dating do's and don'ts said loud laughter was a sign of low breeding. And above her head, as she enters the station, is a government-issued poster of a girl who looks exactly like her, captioned to suggest that she, yes, she, might be giving men gonorrhea. It was an environment that was, to put it mildly, hard to navigate. Radio made it worse and better at the same time. Dorothy Dix, the pen name of a syndicated advice columnist named Elizabeth Meriwether Gilmer, was by the 1940s one of the most read writers in America, and her column ran in hundreds of papers. But she also had a radio presence, and her measured southern voice came into millions of kitchens every evening, dispensing the same advice she had been giving for decades, slightly adjusted for wartime. Don't marry in haste. Don't write to more than one soldier at a time. Don't break off a long-standing engagement for a dashing stranger in a foreign uniform. Dorothy Dix, who was by then in her 80s, managed to sound like everyone's unshockable grandmother, which, in a country full of panicked mothers, was deeply reassuring. Then there was Our Miss Brooks and shows like it. Dramatic radio programs that modelled correct courtship behaviour for young women listening at home. The heroines of these shows were bright, capable, slightly witty, and absolutely chaste. They never telephoned men. They never accepted last-minute dates. They went home at 10 o'clock. They turned down the second drink. And somehow, this is the genuinely impressive part, they made all of it sound aspirational. You wanted to be Miss Brooks. You wanted to be that unflappable, that in control, that quietly admired. The rules, in the end, made up a kind of complete architecture. A young woman knew she should never telephone a man first. She knew she should refuse last-minute dates, because only a girl with no options would accept one. She knew there were curfews, 10 on weeknights, 11 on weekends. And if she missed them, not because her date was disrespectful, but because the trolley was late, she was the one who would be spoken about. She knew she should accept no more than one drink from a serviceman, because a second drink was understood as an implied consent to something she was expected to refuse. She knew, at a USO dance, there was an unwritten 3-dance limit with any single partner, and if she exceeded it, a gentle but firm volunteer hostess would tap her on the shoulder and redirect her. She knew she should not sit on a man's lap in public, even a fiancé's. She knew, above all, that she should not write letters to more than one soldier. Unless, the pamphlets conceded, they were brothers, cousins, or close family friends, a loophole of which a truly remarkable number of American girls took full and generous advantage. She knew all of this because it was printed, because it was on the radio, because her mother, her aunt, her school principal, her pastor, her scoutmaster, her magazine, and, yes, her federal government had all told her, in slightly different words, the same story. And here is the quiet, stubborn, wonderful truth about young people in 1943, which historians like Beth Bailey, in her later book From Front Porch to Back Seat, would eventually document with great care. They broke the rules constantly. They broke them gently. They broke them cheerfully. They broke them in the dark corners of canteens and in the backs of taxicabs and on the observation decks of train stations and in the doorways of boarding houses and on blacked-out London streets and on the decks of troop ships and in the shadows of barns from Iowa to Cornwall. They broke the 3-dance rule. They broke the perfume on paper rule. They broke the no telephone rule, the curfew rule, the 1-drink rule, the no last-minute date rule, the no sitting on his lap rule. And, with particular enthusiasm, the rule about writing to only one soldier at a time. The rules were a kind of weather. Young people walked through them, got rained on, shook themselves off, and kept going. But to understand where they were going, you have to see the place they were walking toward. A place with folding tables and donuts under glass domes. A place with coffee urns and Rita Hayworth pin-ups and a piano in the corner. A place where movie stars washed dishes and volunteers in gingham dresses smiled at every private who walked through the door. A place with its own specific, peculiar, heavily enforced rules, invented in the spring of 1941 and exported within 3 years to every corner of the world American boys had been sent. The canteen, the USO, the most important square of dance floor in the entire war. Let's walk inside. The door opens into warmth and the first thing you notice is the smell. Coffee, weak, endlessly refilled, kept hot on an urn the size of a small water heater. Donuts under glass domes, slightly stale, powdered with sugar that drifts onto the tablecloths every time the door opens behind you. Cigarette smoke, of course, because this is 1943, and cigarette smoke is simply what the interior of rooms smells like. Beneath that, faintly, the mingled perfumes of 30 young women who have been told firmly not to wear too much perfume, and who have each interpreted that instruction with the generous optimism of the young. A piano in the corner is being played, not well, by someone's cousin who knows 3 Glenn Miller tunes and is working very hard at a 4th. The walls are hung with posters. Rita Hayworth kneeling on a bed in a nightgown. Betty Grable over her shoulder. A large banner that says, in cheerful red letters, "Welcome Servicemen." A smaller sign tacked beside the coat rack that says, in less cheerful letters, "Hostesses are not permitted to leave the premises with servicemen. You are in a USO canteen." There are, at this moment in the war, more than 3,000 of them, scattered across the United States and across the world, and they are, collectively, the single largest dating infrastructure ever deliberately built by a human government. The USO, the United Service Organizations, was founded on February 4th, 1941, nearly a year before the United States formally entered the war, when President Roosevelt persuaded 6 existing charitable organizations to merge their resources into one unified effort to support the morale of servicemen. The 6 were the YMCA, the YWCA, the National Catholic Community Service, the Salvation Army, the Jewish Welfare Board, and the National Travelers Aid Association. A coalition so ecumenical that simply getting them all in the same room was itself a minor miracle of American diplomacy. The logic was simple. Young men were being pulled away from home in unprecedented numbers. They needed somewhere clean, cheap, well-lit and respectable to spend their evenings. They needed sandwiches. They needed writing paper. They needed a piano. And, not incidentally, they needed to meet nice girls in a supervised setting that would produce photographs for Life magazine rather than headlines in the police blotter. Within 3 years, the USO operated over 3,000 clubs worldwide. In converted churches, in railroad station waiting rooms, in airplane hangars, on tropical airfields, in the basements of department stores, in repurposed dance halls, and, most famously, in 2 extraordinary locations where the distance between movie screen and reality briefly and memorably collapsed. The first of these was the Hollywood Canteen, which opened on October 3rd, 1942, on Cahuenga Boulevard in Los Angeles, in a converted barn of a building that had once been a livery stable. It was the personal project of 2 movie stars, Bette Davis, who was then 34 and at the peak of her formidable powers, and John Garfield, the brooding young actor from New York who had been rejected for military service because of a heart condition and who poured his frustration into the canteen instead. Their idea was audacious and simple. Any enlisted serviceman in uniform could walk through the door, free of charge, and inside he would find actual Hollywood stars serving him sandwiches, pouring him coffee, and, if he dared to ask, dancing with him. Officers were not admitted. This was a rule Bette Davis was quite firm about. The Hollywood Canteen was for privates, corporals, sergeants, sailors, Marines, airmen, and not, under any circumstances, for colonels looking to impress Marlene Dietrich. And Marlene Dietrich was genuinely there. So was Hedy Lamarr, who, in addition to being one of the most beautiful women in the world, was also a self-taught inventor, then working on a frequency-hopping torpedo guidance system that would, decades later, become the basis for Wi-Fi. So were Rita Hayworth and Joan Crawford and Betty Grable herself, and at various points nearly every major star on the Warner Brothers, MGM and Paramount lots. They washed dishes, they served coffee, they signed the guest book. They did not, per canteen rules, sign autographs, because autographs would have created chaos, and also because the point was not to be a star for the evening, but to be a girl, a volunteer, a pair of hands passing a plate across a counter. Bette Davis herself was once spotted by a visiting Marine washing a mountain of coffee cups in the back kitchen, sleeves rolled up, hair in a scarf, looking, he later said, exactly like his aunt in Wichita. The second of the great canteens was the Stage Door Canteen in New York City, which had actually opened earlier, in March 1942, in the basement of the 44th Street Theatre, just off Times Square. The Stage Door was the creation of the American Theatre Wing, and it drew its volunteers from Broadway rather than Hollywood. Catherine Cornell, Helen Hayes, Lynn Fontanne, Alfred Lunt, and, when he happened to be in town, Irving Berlin, who would sit down at the piano and play his own songs while servicemen stood around him in respectful disbelief. A 1943 film called Stage Door Canteen was made about the place, directed by Frank Borzage, which featured an astonishing number of real stars playing themselves, and which helped embed the whole canteen idea in the mythology of the war. If you have ever seen a scene of a soldier dancing with a movie star in a Hollywood wartime picture, you are almost certainly looking at a reenactment of the Stage Door or the Hollywood canteen. But the heart of the USO, the beating, donut-powdered heart, was not the glamour of those two famous rooms. It was the 3,000 other rooms, the small-town canteens, the train station canteens, the dusty airfield canteens, and the army of young women who volunteered as junior hostesses in every single one of them. To become a USO junior hostess, a young woman had to be between 18 and 35. She had to be unmarried, or at some clubs, married but approved by her husband in writing. She had to be of what the paperwork called good character, which in practice meant 2 letters of reference, often one from a clergyman, one from a teacher or employer. She had to attend an orientation. She had to agree in writing to a set of rules so specific that they read, at this remove, like a Victorian conduct manual translated into government prose. She could not leave the canteen with a serviceman. She could not give her last name. She could not give her home address. She could not give her telephone number. She could not accept any gift from a serviceman worth more than $1. She could not date any serviceman she met at the canteen, inside or outside the canteen walls. She could not write to a serviceman she had met there unless her correspondence was vetted in some clubs by a supervisor. She was required, on the other hand, to dance with any serviceman who asked her, regardless of his rank, his height, his looks, his manners, his breath, or in some cases, his ability to stay upright. If she did not want to dance with him, she could not say so. She could request a break through a supervisor, who would then redirect the soldier to another partner with practiced diplomacy. This is how the famous 3-dance rule was actually enforced. At larger canteens, a senior hostess, typically a woman in her 40s or 50s, often a veteran of First World War canteen work, would circulate the room with the calm, watchful authority of a school dance chaperone who has seen absolutely everything. If she noticed that a junior hostess had been dancing with the same young man for a suspiciously long stretch, 3 songs, perhaps 4, she would ease her way across the floor, tap the junior hostess gently on the shoulder, and redirect her to a boy waiting by the wall. The tap was polite. It was smiling. It was absolutely non-negotiable. The soldier, left suddenly partnerless, was offered a donut by way of consolation. He almost always took it. The music that was playing during all of this is music you already know, even if you think you don't. Glenn Miller's In the Mood, Chattanooga Choo Choo, the Andrews Sisters' Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy of Company B, which was technically a recruitment song, but which everyone treated as pure dance music. I'll Be Seeing You, Slow and Aching, for the last dance of the night. Sentimental Journey, which came along in 1944 and immediately became the anthem of soldiers trying to get home. Each song had its own choreography. The jitterbug, fast, exuberant, acrobatic, was the dance of the moment, and the canteens were full of young people attempting it with varying degrees of success. The Lindy Hop, the jitterbug's more sophisticated cousin, was allowed but monitored. Certain church-run canteens banned both. Certain Catholic-run canteens allowed the jitterbug, but banned cheek-to-cheek slow dancing, which was understood, with some reason, to be where the real trouble began. There was a whole V-disc program, V for Victory, producing special 12-inch records sent only to troops, featuring recordings made during the 1942 musician strike that civilians could not legally buy. Frank Sinatra sang on V-discs. Bing Crosby sang on V-discs. Duke Ellington recorded V-discs. They were played in canteens from Reykjavik to Guadalcanal, and when the shellac wore out, as it always did, the records were replaced from enormous canvas sacks of fresh ones arriving with the mail. All of this warmth, all of this donut-scented, piano-tinkling, cheek-to-cheek forbidden warmth was, for the vast majority of American servicemen, strictly segregated. Most USO clubs were either explicitly for white servicemen or, in the South, run under local segregation laws that made integration legally impossible. Separate clubs were established for black servicemen, staffed by black junior hostesses, and these clubs were, with grinding predictability, funded less generously, housed in worse buildings, and staffed by fewer volunteers. There were exceptions. The Savoy Ballroom in Harlem, which was not a USO club, but which became a de facto wartime canteen for soldiers on leave in New York, was one of the few integrated dance spaces in the country, where black and white soldiers danced with black and white women under the same chandeliers, to the same Count Basie arrangements, in a kind of quiet premonition of a country that did not yet exist. Some northern USO clubs quietly integrated as the war went on. Some southern ones did not until the 1960s. The rules of love in America have always been rules of race, and the canteen was no exception. And yet, and this is what makes the canteens genuinely fascinating, not just as social history, but as human history, the rules did not entirely hold. They could not. You cannot put 30 young women and 300 young men in a room with a piano and a stack of Glenn Miller records and expect, at the end of the evening, that no phone numbers have been exchanged. They were exchanged. Of course they were. They were whispered between dance steps. They were written on napkins and slid into palms. They were embedded in the paper of cigarette packs. Addresses were memorized, which is a lost art now, but which in 1943 was taught in school as routine arithmetic of the heart. A junior hostess might not be allowed to give her address, but she could, in theory, mention the street she lived on in passing 3 times during the course of an evening. A soldier who wasn't listening deserved whatever he got. Hundreds of thousands of couples met in USO canteens during the war. The USO's own later estimates suggested that tens of thousands of marriages began on those dance floors. Real marriages, the kind that produced children and grandchildren, and family photos on mantels in towns the happy couple never imagined they would end up in. The canteen was supposed to be a safe, chaperoned, rule-bound alternative to the wild world outside. It was. It also, quietly, stubbornly, inevitably, became the single biggest matchmaker of the 20th century. At the end of each night, the lights dimmed. The piano player, finally, played the song that every canteen used as its closer, because every canteen in the English-speaking world, and many that were not, had agreed, without a meeting, that this was the song that ended the evening. Vera Lynn's "We'll Meet Again." Don't know where, don't know when. The junior hostesses in their white blouses sang along softly. The soldiers swayed with them, not dancing anymore, just leaning. And then the overhead lights came up, the spell broke, and the boys filed out into the blackout, into London fog or New York rain, or the particular flat Kansas dark of a base-town street, with donut sugar on their sleeves and an address in their pocket that they were not, technically, supposed to have. Outside, the war was waiting. And outside, so were other rules. Harder ones, meaner ones. The rules, as it turned out, that didn't care very much about being broken gently. Because outside the canteen, there was another set of young women entirely. Women who had not filled out the paperwork, had not gotten the reference letters from a clergyman and a teacher, had not been issued the gingham uniform and the 3-dance rule. Women who had simply shown up on their own at train stations and bus depots and the low-slung diners across from army bases, hoping to meet a soldier. And those women, as you will see, had a much harder time of it. They had a name. Several names, actually, because Americans in the 1940s were not people to let a moral panic go unnicknamed. They were called Victory Girls. They were called V-Girls. They were called khaki-wackies and good-time Charlottes, and, in one especially cruel coinage that seems to have been invented by a magazine columnist who was quite pleased with himself, patriotutes. A portmanteau of patriot and prostitute that did exactly the work it was designed to do. These were, for the most part, not professional prostitutes. That is the thing that matters and that keeps getting forgotten. They were teenagers. They were girls of 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, sometimes a little older, who had grown up through the Depression, who had watched every boy they knew put on a uniform and disappear, who had read the same magazines you have already heard about, which told them it was patriotic to be friendly to soldiers, and who had then, being 14 or 15 or 16, interpreted that instruction with a certain teenage enthusiasm. They hung around Penn Station in New York. They hung around Union Station in Washington, D.C., where troop trains pulled in day and night. They hung around the Greyhound Terminal in Norfolk, Virginia, which, as a port town crammed with sailors, developed a nationwide reputation as the single rowdiest stretch of pavement on the eastern seaboard. They hung around the gates of Fort Bragg and the bus stop outside Camp Pendleton, and the little main street of Columbus, Georgia, which fed into Fort Benning, and Fayetteville, North Carolina, which fed into Fort Bragg, and a dozen other base towns that had gone, in the space of 18 months, from quiet agricultural centers to overwhelmed military cities with twice or three times the population they had been built for. And they offered company. Sometimes that meant a walk. Sometimes it meant a drink. Sometimes it meant a movie, or a dance at a non-USO hall where nobody was watching the clock. Sometimes, yes, it meant sex. But unlike professional prostitutes, they did not charge. That was the thing that most upset the authorities. Although the authorities phrased it differently, they gave the company for free. They gave it because they were lonely, or bored, or infatuated with a uniform, or convinced, and this was the most heartbreaking motivation of all, that this was their genuine patriotic duty. They had been told in 1,000 different ways by 1,000 different magazines that a smile from a girl back home was what kept the boys fighting. Some of them had simply taken that instruction to its logical conclusion. The government, needless to say, was not charmed. What the government was looking at from its desks in Washington was a statistical panic. Venereal disease rates in the military were rising. By 1943, the Army was losing the equivalent of an entire division of soldiers per year to gonorrhea and syphilis. Men pulled off the line, sent to hospital wards, pumped full of the new and miraculous but not yet universally available penicillin, which had only begun mass production for military use that year. Somebody had to be blamed, and somebody was. The American Social Hygiene Association, an advocacy group that had been agitating about sexual morality since the 1910s, stepped forward with a theory that would have very real consequences for tens of thousands of young women. Professional prostitutes, the ASHA claimed, were not the real problem. The real problem was the amateur, the good time girl, the V-girl, the khaki-wacky teenager, who was, allegedly, single-handedly doing more to spread VD through the armed forces than every brothel in America combined. The claim was never actually proven. It could not be. The statistics simply did not exist. But it was asserted loudly enough, and often enough, and by people with enough letterhead that it became policy. The policy was the May Act. Passed on July 11th, 1941, the May Act, named for Representative Andrew Jackson May of Kentucky, who would later be convicted of wartime bribery and whose name now feels a little ironic attached to a morality law, made it a federal offense to practice prostitution near a military base. That is how it was advertised. That is not, in practice, how it was used. Because the wording was broad, and because enforcement was devolved to local authorities, who had their own ideas about what a girl walking past the base gate at 10 p.m. was doing there, the May Act rapidly became a tool for arresting almost any young woman who appeared to the officer on duty to be out of place. You did not have to be caught in an act. You did not have to exchange money. You did not have to be a prostitute at all. You simply had to be female, unaccompanied, and in the wrong part of town, at the wrong hour, near the wrong kind of men. The man put in charge of enforcing all of this at the federal level was a name you already know, even if you have never associated him with this chapter of his life. Eliot Ness. Yes, that Eliot Ness. The Eliot Ness who had taken down Al Capone in Chicago. the Eliot Ness of the Untouchables. By the war years, his career had taken a turn, and he was serving as the director of the Division of Social Protection inside the Federal Security Agency, which meant he spent the mid-1940s leading a national campaign against, essentially, teenage girls loitering near army bases. The man who had brought down the most famous mobster in American history finished his government career filing reports about V-girls in Columbus, Georgia. History does not always go where you expect. The arrests, once they started, were staggering. In San Diego alone, nearly 4,000 young women were arrested in 1942 for what the local authorities called wayward behavior near the naval base. Not 4,000 prostitutes. 4,000 women swept up on suspicion. The historian Marilyn Hegarty, in her book Victory Girls, Khaki-Wackies and Patriotutes, which is where much of what we now know about these arrests comes from, documented more than 40,000 girls detained across the country during the war years on essentially moral charges. Many of these were held without trial. Many were sent to something called a detention home, or a rehabilitation facility, or in the older language that never quite died, a reformatory. Some of these were state institutions. Some were church-run. Some were contracted to the federal government under something called Plan B, which was a euphemism so bland it almost makes you admire the bureaucrats who came up with it. A girl detained under these laws might be 13. She might be 14. She might have been picked up for the offence of walking home from a diner past curfew. She would be given a medical examination, a phrase that, in the context of 1940s sexual hygiene policy, you should read with a small flinch. And she would be held for weeks, sometimes months, sometimes the duration of the war. She would be rehabilitated. She would often be released into domestic service or into a job at a mill with a probation officer checking in on her whereabouts. She would carry the record for the rest of her life. Some of these records are, astonishingly, still sealed. Some are still being unsealed. The racial disparity in these arrests was exactly what you are now expecting it to be. Black women were arrested at dramatically higher rates than white women on dramatically thinner evidence. In cities like Washington, D.C., a black woman walking alone in certain neighborhoods after dark was a priori suspect under the May Act. In Norfolk, in Charleston, in Jacksonville, the same pattern repeated. The statistics that survive are incomplete and uncomfortable and not actually in dispute among historians. The system was not accidentally racist. It was racist the way most American systems of that era were racist, which is to say by design, cheerfully and with paperwork, and the curfews. I should mention the curfews because they are the part that feels, to modern ears, the most surreal. In base towns across the country, local ordinances were passed during the war giving police the authority to stop, question and detain any unaccompanied woman under the age of 21 who was out in public after, variously, 9 p.m., 10 p.m. or 11 p.m., depending on the town. Columbus, Georgia, Fayetteville, North Carolina, parts of Norfolk, parts of San Diego. A 17-year-old girl walking home from her shift at a drugstore at 9:15 could, on the strength of a single officer's suspicion, be taken in. She did not have to be doing anything. She had to be female and young and outside. All of this was happening, and this is the contradiction that the government never quite solved, that I suspect it never fully even noticed. At the same time, the same government was producing pin-up posters of Betty Grable in a white bathing suit, distributing them to every barracks in the country and telling soldiers to remember what they were fighting for. At the same time, the USO was recruiting thousands of junior hostesses and promising soldiers a wholesome dance. At the same time, Hollywood was releasing movie after movie about whirlwind wartime romance. The state wanted its young women to be flirtatious but not sexual, morale-boosting but not available, warm but not warm, friendly but not friendly, patriotic enough to write letters but not patriotic enough to mean them. The propaganda the government distributed to accompany all of this is genuinely some of the most unsettling material to survive the period. She may look clean, but, the poster said, above an image of a pretty girl in ordinary clothes, smiling. She may be a bag of trouble, said another. Jukebox. Romance can't replace the real thing. Loose lips sink ships, in the romantic variant, became loose lips, loose morals, loose country. The Office of War Information printed millions of these. They went up in barracks, in hospitals, in train station men's rooms. The visual logic was always the same. The girl looked normal. The girl looked like somebody's sister. The girl looked, in fact, like the girl a soldier might actually want to meet. And that was the point. The poster was telling you that you could not trust the evidence of your own eyes. Any girl at all, might be hiding a secret diagnosis, a secret past, a secret threat to your military readiness. The pretty ones were the worst. You can imagine, I hope, what it was like to be a young woman in America in 1943 and to walk past one of these posters every day on your way to the drugstore or the munitions plant or the church. To understand that the government had decided at some level that you were the enemy. Not the Germans, you. Some of these girls were, by their own eventual testimony, sex workers. Some were teenagers experimenting. Some were women in genuinely abusive situations at home who had run toward the bus station because the bus station was where the lights were. Some were, and I say this with the historical caution the material deserves, probably nothing more than young women who had walked to meet a friend and had made the mistake of doing it at the wrong hour in the wrong town. They were not criminals. They were frightened, lonely, hopeful, foolish, romantic, hungry, restless teenagers who had come of age in a country where normal courtship had been gutted by the Depression and then shattered by the war, and who had tried, with the limited tools available to a teenager in any era, to find some love, or some company, or at the very least some movement in the shadow of something enormous and terrifying that they did not fully understand. They paid for that attempt. Sometimes they paid with a record. Sometimes they paid with months in a detention home. Sometimes they paid with their reputations, which in 1943 was not a small currency. Sometimes they paid with their health, because the medical examinations handed out in detention facilities were not always gentle and not always clean. Sometimes they paid with the rest of their lives, because a girl who had been in a reformatory at 16 was not, by and large, a girl whose town forgot about it at 17. And many of them, when they were asked about it decades later, because some of them were asked in the oral history projects of the 1980s and 1990s, described it without bitterness. They described it with a flat, slightly puzzled recollection of having been caught up in something nobody had explained to them. They had been told to smile at soldiers. They had smiled at soldiers. Somewhere, between the smile and the arrest, a line had been drawn that they had not seen. But the authorities were not only watching the girls. They were also, in their painstaking filing cabinet way, watching the soldiers. Because a soldier, it turned out, could also be a problem. A soldier could fall in love with the wrong woman. A soldier could propose to the wrong woman. A soldier could marry the wrong woman, and in doing so cost his government a great deal of paperwork and potentially a security clearance, and in some extraordinary cases an entire career. So the military, which had already decided to regulate the women, also quietly and meticulously, and with a staggering number of forms in triplicate, decided to regulate the men. The document you want to know about if you were a soldier in the 1940s was Army Regulation 600-750, along with its cousins and amendments in the Navy and Marines. These were the fraternization regulations, and they governed, in essence, who in uniform could socialize romantically with whom else in uniform. The core rule was simple, and it has not really changed in the 80 years since. Officers could not date enlisted. A captain could not take a private to dinner. A lieutenant could not hold hands with a sergeant. A colonel, no matter how kind his eyes, could not sit alone in a car with a corporal. This had been theoretical for most of American military history, because for most of American military history, nearly everyone in uniform was a man, and the rule was mainly about keeping officers from coercing their own subordinates. But in 1942, something new happened. Women started showing up in uniform, in numbers, and the rules suddenly mattered in a way it had not mattered before. The Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was founded on May 15, 1942, and militarized, that is, upgraded from a civilian auxiliary into a genuine component of the Army on July 1st, 1943, at which point it dropped the second A and became simply the WAC. The Waves, the Navy's female corps, officially the women accepted for volunteer emergency service, because the military could never resist an acronym if it required torturing the English language to produce one, were founded on July 30th, 1942. There were the Spas in the Coast Guard, the women Marines who were never given a cute nickname and who firmly preferred it that way, and eventually the WASPs, the Women Air Force Service pilots who flew aircraft across the continental United States and were, astonishingly, classified as civilians the entire time, so the government would not have to pay their death benefits. Tens of thousands of young women suddenly were in uniform, and tens of thousands of young women in uniform were suddenly, by regulation, forbidden from dating large categories of young men in uniform, because a great many of those young men were officers, and a great many of those young women were enlisted. Picture what this looked like in practice. Picture a dance at an airbase somewhere in England in the spring of 1944. Picture the officers' club on one side of the base and the enlisted club on the other. Picture a joint social event, because sometimes these happened, especially when a base needed to let off steam and the brass wanted a morale boost. And picture, on the floor, an actual line of chalk, or tape, or rope, dividing the officers from the enlisted, not metaphorically, a literal line, drawn on a dance floor, in some accounts enforced by an MP standing with his arms folded like an unusually large and very unsmiling bouncer. A WAC private who wandered too close to the officer's side could be warned. A captain who leaned across the rope to ask a sergeant if she wanted to dance could find himself being written up the next morning. There are memoirs from women who served in the WAC describing the strangeness of going to a dance in a room full of men, and finding that the only ones she was permitted to flirt with were the ones she already knew from her barracks, which rather defeated the point of the dance. Violations of the fraternization rule could end careers. An officer who married an enlisted woman under his command could be formally reprimanded, reassigned, passed over for promotion, or, in extreme cases, court-martialed. The enlisted woman, for her part, might be discharged, and this is worth sitting with. An officer who did the same thing with a civilian woman he met in town, at a pub, at a canteen, was usually fine. It was the uniform that was the problem, not the romance. Now multiply this complexity by the fact that the United States was also, as a side project, sending several million of these young men to countries where young women lived. Countries like Britain, countries like Australia, countries like France, Italy, Germany, the Philippines, Japan, and every other place the war took them. And the government, which had opinions about everything, also had opinions about this. If an American serviceman wanted to marry a foreign national, a British girl he met at a dance in Norwich, an Australian nurse he met at a hospital in Brisbane, a French farm girl he met when his unit was billeted outside Caen, he could not simply propose and marry her. He had to ask permission, in writing, from his commanding officer, under a set of War Department directives that tightened and loosened and tightened again across the war years, but never went away. The process, if you were the soldier, went something like this. You filed an application. You disclosed in detail how you had met the woman, how long you had known her, and what her circumstances were. Your commanding officer, who was a man with a great many things to think about, and who was now being asked to think about your love life as well, would initiate an investigation. The local police would be asked about her family. In some cases, the FBI would be pulled in. The woman herself would be required to undergo a medical examination, primarily for venereal disease and pregnancy. Her political affiliations would be checked. If she had, for instance, been a member of any organization that someone in a uniform had decided to write down on a list, the permission could be, and sometimes was, denied. If you married her anyway, without permission, you could be court-martialed. Let me say that again because it does not really land the first time. You could be put on trial by the United States military for marrying a woman without approval. Despite all of this, over 1 million American servicemen married foreign women during and in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War. Over 100,000 of them married British women alone. Tens of thousands more married Australians, French women, Belgians, Dutch women, Italians, Germans, Japanese, Chinese, Filipinas, and, in much smaller numbers, women from nearly every other country the American flag travelled to. Love, as we have already noted, is stubborn. The paperwork tried. It really tried. Love won anyway, one permission slip at a time. The rules shifted with the political weather. During active combat, marriages to German or Italian women were officially forbidden as fraternization with the enemy. After surrender, they were permitted with the same permission process. In 1945, after Germany's defeat, General Eisenhower issued a famously strict non-fraternization order that banned American soldiers from socializing with Germans at all, not just dating. Any socializing, no conversations, no shared drinks, no playing with German children in the street. This order collapsed within weeks. Within months, it was a dead letter. Within a year, the slang term Fraulein, American G1 English for a German girlfriend, was ubiquitous in occupied zones, and the army had quietly given up and replaced the ban with a marriage approval process that looked a great deal like the one the British had had all along. And then there were the rules inside the rules. The ones that did not come from the War Department at all, but from the laws of the states a soldier was going home to. Because the United States in 1944 was a country in which 30 states had laws on the books forbidding interracial marriage. Anti-miscegenation laws they were called, and they were not a dusty 19th century relic. They were enforced, they were updated, they were used. Consider what this meant for a Japanese-American soldier. The men of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, the famously decorated All-Nisei unit, fought in Italy and France with a level of courage that embarrassed the argument for their existence as a segregated unit. They were American citizens. Many of them had families still interned in camps in the American West. And when they went home, if they tried to marry a white American woman, a woman they had known before the war, or a woman they had met on leave, they could not, legally, in 30 states. A soldier who had earned a Silver Star in the Vosges Mountains could not marry his sweetheart in California because California had a law. The Japanese war brides, the women some of these men met overseas or whom other American soldiers met during the occupation of Japan, faced their own separate set of walls. Under existing immigration law, Asian women were largely barred from entering the United States at all, regardless of whom they had married. It took the Soldier Brides Act of 1947 to open a narrow door. It took the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952 to finally end the racial exclusions entirely. And even then, finally is doing some work in that sentence. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, the British military was running its own version of the same bureaucracy. Women in the ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, and in the WRNS, the Women's Royal Naval Service, operated under their own fraternization and marriage rules. British servicewomen needed permission to marry. They were officially forbidden, in many postings, from wearing civilian clothes while on dates. They were confined to barracks after certain hours. Their love lives, like their American counterparts, were subject to inspection. And then there were the collisions. Because here is the thing about putting several million American men of various races and backgrounds into a country the size of Britain, and then telling them there are rules, and then telling the locals there are different rules. Things happen. In 1943, in the village of Bamber Bridge in Lancashire, a confrontation between black American soldiers and white American military police erupted into a full-scale mutiny that has become known as the Battle of Bamber Bridge. It was, on paper, about discipline. It was, in practice, about many things, and one of them was dating. The local English pubs had been happily serving black American troops alongside white British customers. The white Southern officers of the American units did not like this. They attempted to impose American-style segregation on the pubs. The British, to their lasting credit, mostly refused. And underneath all of it was the explosive question of which American soldiers were dancing with which British girls, and what the presence of black American men in uniform, courted by white British women, meant for the racial order that white American officers had brought overseas with them in their duffel bags. The Australians had their own version of this collision. Overpaid, oversexed, and over here. the local joke went, about the American troops pouring into Queensland and New South Wales on the way to the Pacific. Australian men, whose girlfriends and sisters and wives were being taken to dances by tall strangers with better pay, better uniforms, and an endless supply of chocolate and nylons, were not uniformly delighted. In November of 1942, the resentment boiled over into what is now called the Battle of Brisbane, an actual riot between American and Australian soldiers that left at least one Australian dead and hundreds injured. The proximate cause was a dispute between MPs. The underlying cause was, at least in part, girls. And finally, woven through all of this, was the paperwork most soldiers never thought about until they had to. A serviceman's life insurance, his allotment, the portion of his pay he could direct home, his beneficiaries in the event he did not come back. All of these required forms, and all of these required named individuals. And all of these meant that getting married or being engaged or simply being seriously involved with someone had financial consequences that the United States Treasury took an interest in. If you married a woman, her name went on a government form. If she was foreign, her file followed. If she was later divorced from you, that was a federal paperwork event. Love, in the 1940s, had become, for the first time in American history on this scale, a matter of state. Not a matter of the heart alone, and not a matter of the family alone, and not even a matter of the church alone. A matter of chaplains and colonels and censors and clerks, and the ink on 1,000 rubber stamps pressed wearily down onto forms no one today remembers the numbers of. And for every soldier who filed the paperwork correctly, there were, as there always are, the ones who did not. The ones who fell in love faster than the forms could process. The ones whose letters we are about to read. Because in the end, what actually held these relationships together, across oceans and time zones, and the entire apparatus of the state, was paper. Paper and ink, and the slow, maddening, miraculous fact of the mail. During the Second World War, Americans sent and received approximately 6 billion pieces of mail between home and the front. 6 billion. Take a moment, if you are still with me, and let that number go soft at the edges, the way numbers do when they get too big. 6 billion letters. 6 billion small white envelopes, each one containing somebody's mother, somebody's sister, somebody's sweetheart, somebody's quiet little jokes about the weather. 6 billion times a piece of one person's heart was handed to a clerk, who handed it to a sack, who handed it to a train, who handed it to a ship, who handed it to a truck, who handed it to a tired man in a muddy field in France, who opened it with hands that had not been clean in 3 weeks. The logistics of that, if you think about it for even a moment, are absurd. Which is why, in June of 1942, the United States Post Office and the War Department introduced a thing called V-mail, Victory Mail, modelled closely on a British system called airgraph, which the British, as they tended to, had been quietly using for a couple of years already. V-mail worked like this. You went to the post office, or to your canteen, or to your base supply, and you got a sheet. A single, standardized sheet, about 7 inches by 9. You wrote your letter on the sheet, staying within the margins, because the margins were important. You handed the sheet in. A clerk opened it. A censor read it, and then a technician photographed it, reducing the image to a little negative about the size of a postage stamp on a roll of microfilm. The microfilm was flown overseas. and on the other end, the reverse process. The film was developed. The image was printed onto a small 4x5 photographic sheet. And that sheet, your words, shrunk down to a miniature version of themselves, was the letter your sweetheart actually received. A single mail sack of V-mail microfilm could replace 37 sacks of ordinary paper mail, which meant 37 sacks of cargo space could instead be used for bandages, or bullets, or spare parts, or tinned peaches. It was, by any measure, a brilliant piece of wartime engineering. It was also, if you really think about it, strange. Lovers wrote on thin, standardized forms, in handwriting they knew would be photographed by strangers, reduced in size, and delivered as a tiny, pale version of itself. You could not slip in a pressed flower. You could not send a real lock of hair. You could not even use a heavy paper that felt like paper. You wrote, instead, on the official V-mail stationery, and you accepted that the letter your beloved held in his hand would be, quite literally, smaller than the letter you had sent. Some people wrote V-mail. Some people still wrote regular letters, on whatever they had, and accepted the longer journey. Most people did both. And all of it, V-mail and regular mail both, went through the censors. At its peak, the United States Office of Censorship employed over 10,000 people, most of them women, most of them sitting at long tables in ordinary-looking offices, opening other people's love letters with a small, sharp tool, reading, marking, and resealing. They were looking for information, any reference to a place name, any reference to a unit, any mention of weather, any hint of casualties or morale problems, or equipment, or movement, or timing. All of it was blacked out, carefully with a thick, dark ink the soldiers called censored lipstick. So a letter from your sweetheart at the front might arrive looking like a field of stars, dark rectangles scattered across white paper with only the feelings intact. My darling, I cannot tell you where I am, but the woods here is Uodsa. And I keep thinking of the night we. Behind the wee in ye week. Do you remember? And you would sit on your kitchen floor, 20 years old, and you would read it 3 times, and you would remember, right? Soldiers, being soldiers, tried to beat the system. They developed codes with their sweethearts before shipping out. One trick, very popular and very soon, very caught, was to make the first letter of each sentence spell out a hidden word. So the first sentence began with F, the second with R, the third with A, the fourth with N, and so on. Censors caught most of these. Some, no doubt, they let pass because they had been reading love letters for 8 hours and could not find it in themselves to deny a homesick boy his geography. We will never know how many. There were rules about the letters at home too. The ones travelling the other way, from sweetheart to soldier. They were not censored by the U.S. Office of Censorship in the same way, but they were shaped by a different kind of censorship, softer but just as powerful. The censorship of the advice columnist. The women's magazines of the era were absolutely unanimous on the subject of the morale letter. A letter to a serviceman should be cheerful. Always. It should be newsy, but not burdensome. It should never, ever mention shortages at home, because he had enough to worry about. It should not describe at length how exhausted you were, or how worried your mother had become, or how the neighbour's boy had just been reported missing. If a parent died, you told him, but gently, and only if you had to. If you were ill, you minimized. If the roof was leaking, you made it charming. The letter should close always, with optimism, with a looking forward to, with the assumption stated plainly that he would come home, that you would see each other, that it would all be, in the end, fine. A small lipstick kiss on the page was acceptable, but only if you were engaged or married. Perfume on the paper was permitted, but in moderation, because a heavily scented letter handed down a line of foxholes, full of men who had not seen a woman in 8 months, tended to cause, let us say, a certain distraction. Columnists warned against it, quietly. Elizabeth Woodward, in her Personal Problems column in the Ladies' Home Journal, fielded questions from teenage girls about all of this. Should I tell him I went to a dance with another boy, just as friends? Should I mention that Daddy lost his job? Should I write every day, or will that seem clingy? And the answers she gave reliably were the answers of her generation. Be light, be loyal, be present without being a weight. Write often enough to matter, not so often that he stops opening them. It was, if you think about it, an enormous amount of emotional labour, most of it performed by very young women who were themselves frightened and lonely and tired, instructed by a national press corps to be, on paper, a kind of perpetual sunshine machine. Most of them, to their credit, tried. Some of them, also to their credit, failed. The result of that failure was a thing so common that the era invented a name for it. The Dear John letter. The phrase Dear John seems to have originated in the early 1940s, possibly from a radio program, possibly from barracks slang that spread so fast no one could trace its source. The letter itself was simple in structure, devastating in content. Dear John, I have to tell you something. I've met someone else. I didn't mean for it to happen. Please understand. Variations on that, in 1,000 handwritings, on 1,000 kitchen tables, across 1,000 long evenings, where a young woman stared at a blank page and decided, finally, that she could not keep waiting. When a Dear John letter arrived at a barracks or a forward position, the reaction was ritualized. Often the recipient's friends would find out before he did. Sometimes, by a tradition that emerged somewhere in the Pacific and spread everywhere, the letter would be read aloud to the whole barracks in a mocking, theatrical voice. Not to hurt the man, but to make the thing smaller, to transform it from a private humiliation into a shared joke, to shrink it, the way V-mail shrank a letter into something a person could carry. Not every man wanted this. Not every letter got the treatment. But it happened often enough, in enough units, that the cultural memory of the Second World War includes a surprisingly large number of Dear John letters being performed badly by bored servicemen to an audience of exhausted men laughing so they would not have to do the other thing. Balancing out the Dear Johns in the strange arithmetic of wartime mail was the pen pal economy, which was enormous. The War Department had a whole Letters from Home initiative. Magazines ran pen pal columns matching lonely soldiers with young women willing to write. Community organizations organized letter-writing drives at high schools and churches. The official guidance was that a young woman should write to no more than one serviceman, unless she was related or engaged to each of them. The unofficial guidance, whispered in slightly looser publications, was less strict because, as one column put it carefully, not every boy will be home to read every letter, and a young woman's kindness went further when it was distributed. Some girls embraced this with enthusiasm that alarmed the authorities. In 1943, Life magazine published a photo spread on young women in Iowa who were each writing to dozens of servicemen at a time, dozens, from a single kitchen table covered in envelopes. The article meant to be heartwarming. It came across to many readers as something else. The girls were, in one reading, saints. In another, they were running a kind of pleasant, cheerful, multi-front flirtation operation, the likes of which even Victorian novelists had not imagined. And somewhere in between the official and the unofficial was Margaret Chung, Mom Chung, as she was called. The first American-born Chinese female physician, a San Francisco doctor who, beginning in the late 1930s, began adopting servicemen as her sons. She wrote to them. She kept track of them. She received them at her home when they were on leave. And by the end of the war, she had over 1,500 adopted sons scattered across every front, each of whom received her letters, her care packages, her steady, maternal, entirely platonic attention. Pilots called themselves her fair-haired bastards. Submariners called themselves her golden dolphins. She was not related to any of them. She was, in a sense, related to all of them. She wrote to everyone. The actual content of preserved wartime letters, if you have ever sat in an archive and read a stack of them, is not what you would expect. It is not all longing and poetry. It is mostly small. A soldier named Charles writing to his wife Barbara about how he misses her meatloaf. A young woman named Dorothy writing to her fiancé in the Pacific about how the neighbor's dog has learned a new trick. A farm girl in Indiana writing to a B-17 gunner in England about the precise progress of her tomato plants. Ration recipes, church gossip, the spelling mistakes of a younger sister. These letters are, almost all of them, boring. And they are, almost all of them, the most important thing the person who wrote them did that year. Because the mundanity was the point. The point was not to be poetic. The point was to be present. To say, on thin paper across 4,000 miles, I am still here. My life is still happening. Yours will still be here when you come back. The dog is fine. The garden is fine. I am fine. Come home. Soldiers read these letters by flashlight in foxholes. They reread them until the paper fell apart at the creases. They carried them folded inside helmet liners against the inside of the webbing, where they soaked up sweat and rain and stayed there for months. When the bundle became too thick to carry, men would sometimes painfully bury their oldest ones in a slit trench, saying a small private goodbye to paragraphs about a dog they had never met. At home, the reverse ritual. Women gathered around kitchen tables with the latest arrival, reading aloud to a mother, a sister, a best friend. The good parts twice, the censored parts with a shrug. The signature touched briefly with a fingertip. The paper kissed or not kissed, depending on the kind of girl she was and whether anyone was looking. And then the letter pressed flat inside a scrapbook or added to a bundle tied with a ribbon and kept in the top drawer of a dresser, or, eventually, in the bottom of a shoebox beneath a bed. I want you to picture a shoebox, a plain one, cardboard, a little dented at one corner, slid under the frame of a bed in a small bedroom, in a small house in a small town. 60 years later, a granddaughter finds it. She opens it. Inside, a bundle of onion skin letters tied with a piece of faded ribbon the color of old roses. She unties the ribbon. Her grandmother never did. Somewhere in that shoebox, beneath the scent of old paper and camphor, is the rest of this story. Not the government's version, not the pamphlets' version, not the censor's version. Theirs. Theirs, it turns out, is not quite over when the war ends. Because when the shooting stops, a new chapter begins. And it is, in its own bureaucratic way, one of the strangest chapters of all. Because now, finally, after years of paperwork and permission slips and censored letters and chalk lines across dance floors, the young people who had somehow, against all the rules, managed to fall in love were going to be allowed to do something about it. They were going to be allowed to get married. They were just going to have to fill out, about 40 more forms first. The legal machinery that made post-war love possible was set in motion on December 28th, 1945, when President Harry Truman signed the War Brides Act. The law did something the American immigration system had not really done before. It allowed the foreign wives and the children of U.S. servicemen to immigrate to the United States outside of the normal quota system, which meant, quietly and in plain black and white legal text, that a British shopgirl who had married a GI in a registry office in Norwich in 1944 did not have to wait in line behind 30,000 other British applicants to join her husband. She could, with the right paperwork, simply come. 6 months later, in June of 1946, Congress passed the follow-up, the GWAS Fiancés Act, which extended the same courtesy to women who had only gotten as far as engaged before the war swept their man home. The catch, and there was always a catch, was that she had to marry him within 90 days of arrival in the United States, or she had to go home. 90 days. Imagine that flight, that ship crossing, that train ride across a country she had never seen, knowing she had 3 months to decide whether this man, whom she had mostly known in a uniform, in a foreign country, during the strangest years of both of their lives, was going to be her husband for the rest of her life. The GWAS Fiancé Act did not send very many women home. Most of them, bless them, simply made it work. The numbers, when you look them up in the US Army's own records, are staggering in a quiet way. Approximately 115,000 war brides came to America under these acts. About 70,000 of them were British. Around 15,000 were Australian. Thousands more were French, Belgian, Dutch, Italian, and, eventually, German and Japanese, and Chinese and Filipino. Every one of them arrived with a suitcase, a marriage certificate, a photograph, and, very often, a child on her hip. Because the war had been long, and paperwork had been slow, and a great many of these marriages had already produced, as marriages tend to, the next generation. The transportation of this enormous human cargo fell in large part to a single ship, the Queen Mary. The great Cunard liner had spent the war as a troop carrier, ferrying American soldiers across the Atlantic in bunks stacked so close you could not roll over. Now, with the war over, the bunks were rearranged, the gun emplacements removed, and the Queen Mary, along with her sister ship, the Queen Elizabeth, and a fleet of smaller vessels, was turned into a floating bridal suite. Over the course of 1946, the Queen Mary alone carried more than 20,000 war brides to American ports. The first voyage, the one that set the pattern, left Southampton on January 26, 1946. On board were 452 wives and 173 children. The Red Cross, with its genius for logistics, had set up nurseries on deck. Volunteer nurses walked the corridors at night. Diaper services were improvised. The ship's laundry, which had previously handled only men's uniforms, was suddenly overwhelmed with small pastel things. And, Because this was an American operation in a very American decade, the voyage included classes, Americanization classes, taught on board by Red Cross volunteers to young women who were about to become American wives and had, many of them, never left their home county before. The curriculum was earnest and, in retrospect, very slightly comic. How to use a can opener, since most American homes had one, and most British homes did not. What a drugstore was, and why it sold sandwiches. The critical distinction between a biscuit, which in America was a small bread roll served at breakfast, and a cookie, which was what in England you would have called a biscuit. How to greet your mother-in-law, which was apparently a topic so fraught it required its own lesson. The importance of thank you notes, which were, the instructors explained, taken very seriously in the United States and, if neglected, could end a friendship. There was a booklet, too, something titled along the lines of Good Housekeeping's Guide to Being a Good American Wife, or variations, handed out with great enthusiasm. It explained electric refrigerators. It explained central heating. It explained, with a straight face, the correct way to iron a man's shirt in a country that had both more shirts and more electricity than the bride was used to. The brides listened politely. Many of them were, I suspect, quietly terrified. Because the thing about a war bride voyage is that as the ship pulled away from Southampton or Sydney or Cherbourg, a young woman watched her own country shrink to a line of chalk on the horizon and understood quite clearly that she might never see it again. She was going to a man she had known for, in some cases, less than a year of actual face-to-face time, to a family she had never met, to a town whose name she could, possibly, not pronounce. The shocks, when they arrived, came in waves. British brides were startled almost to tears by American central heating, which dried out their skin and their hair and their throats, and which ran extravagantly in every room of the house at once. They were stunned by American supermarkets, which after years of rationing looked to them like cathedrals stocked by a very wasteful god. They were baffled by American coffee, by American bread, by the American insistence on ice in every single drink. Australian brides arrived, many of them, in the American South and discovered segregation, discovered separate water fountains, separate waiting rooms, separate schools. They had come from a country with its own deep racial problems, but nothing had prepared them for the choreography of Jim Crow, and more than one Australian bride wrote home, in careful pencil, that she did not understand this place, and was not sure she would. Japanese brides who could not legally come at all under the original 1945 Act due to the old Asian exclusion framework had to wait for a 1947 amendment that briefly opened the door, and then for the 1952 McCarran-Walter Act, which finally removed the last of the explicit racial barriers. When they did arrive, they often arrived into towns that had not, in many cases, forgiven the war, into kitchens where a mother-in-law refused to speak to them, into neighborhoods where children on bicycles called them names. Aiko, Grace Obata, a Japanese war bride brought to rural Kansas, wrote later about spending her first American Christmas in a farmhouse where her husband's family was kind but uncertain, and where the entire town, as she put it, watched her the way you might watch a deer that had wandered into a yard. Not hostile exactly, just unsure what she was going to do next. Avis Fletcher, a British bride from Norwich, met her GI husband at a Red Cross dance in 1944, married him in a small ceremony, and arrived in Arkansas in 1946 to discover, when her husband's mother opened the door, that her husband had never, in any letter, any phone call, any visit home, mentioned that he was married. The family was, the polite word for this is, surprised. Avis stayed. They worked it out. Many years later, the mother-in-law and the war bride were, by all accounts, devoted to each other. But you can imagine that first afternoon. The 7,000 French brides carried their own particular burden, which was the shadow of the occupation. Some of them, in the confused logic of post-war suspicion, were assumed by their new American neighbors to have been collaborators, or worse, simply because they had been young women in France during the German presence. Most of them had not been anything of the kind. They had simply been young and French and in love with an American soldier. But suspicion, as we know, does not always care about facts. The divorce rates, when they came in, told a story the magazines had not prepared anyone for. War brides divorced at dramatically elevated rates in the late 1940s. Not all of them. Many marriages lasted 60, 70 years, but enough of them fell apart. Under the weight of homesickness and culture shock, and husbands who turned out at home to be very different men from the ones they had been on a dance floor in Brisbane or a pub in Lancashire, that sociologists began in the 1950s to study it as a phenomenon. The War Brides Act, for all its generosity, had limits. It only applied to marriages, not to cohabiting partners, not to illegitimate children, which meant that thousands of European women who had lived with GEs for months or years, who had borne their children, who had loved them and been loved in return, were simply left behind when the soldiers' transport ship pulled out of Le Havre. Their children, the so-called GI babies, grew up in villages across Europe with fathers they would never meet, and in many cases would never find. Meanwhile, in the other direction, American women who had married foreign men during the war, a smaller number but still in the thousands, faced their own strange penalties. They were often expected, by custom and by paperwork, to follow their husbands back to Europe or Asia. Their loyalty was quietly questioned. In the paranoid atmosphere of the early Cold War, a woman who had married a Czech soldier or a Polish airman might find herself the subject of polite, persistent questions from men in grey suits. And all the while, back in the United States, the marriage rate was doing something it had never done before. Operation Magic Carpet, the massive effort to bring American troops home from overseas, dumped hundreds of thousands of young men, all at once, into American port cities in late 1945 and early 1946. They got off the ships. They kissed the sweethearts who had waited, and they got married, immediately, in a rush. Reno boomed. Las Vegas, which had only really begun as a wedding town before the war, exploded. Quickie weddings, 48-hour weddings, elope on the train home weddings, city hall weddings with a stranger as a witness. The year 1946 set the all-time American marriage record. 2.29 million marriages in a single year. A rate so high it would not be surpassed until, remarkably, the 1980s, when the population of the country had grown by 100 million people. And here, I think, is the quiet irony of the whole thing. The strange, circular joke of wartime love. The same government that had printed pamphlets telling girls not to dance more than 3 times with the same soldier. The same government that had censored letters with scissors and stamps. The same government that had arrested teenage girls for walking near air bases and court-martialed lieutenants for proposing without permission. That same government, when the war was over, turned itself inside out with bureaucratic generosity. It created immigration categories. It waived quotas. It chartered ocean liners. It issued booklets. It printed forms. It sponsored. It stamped. It approved. The government that had spent 4 years trying to prevent love from happening in the wrong places spent the next 4 years helping it arrive, officially in the right ones. And 115,000 young women, clutching suitcases and babies and marriage certificates in 3 languages, stepped off ships onto American piers and walked into the rest of their lives. Some of them would be homesick forever. Some of them would never go back. Some of them would, quietly, become the most American people in any room they ever walked into. Because people who choose a country tend to love it harder than people who are born to it. The strange rules, in the end, dissolved. The chaperones went home. The USO canteens closed. The priests stopped signing permissions. The censors put down their scissors. The pamphlets yellowed in drawers. And what was left, when all of it faded, was the children, and then the grandchildren, and then the great-grandchildren, of unions that had once required for their making the approval of a colonel, a priest, a censor, a mother, and, quite often, a very tired sergeant with a typewriter and a stack of triplicate forms. Somewhere, right now, in a house somewhere in America, or Australia, or England, or Japan, there is a family photograph on a mantelpiece. A young man in uniform, a young woman in a dress that is slightly too fine for the occasion. Both of them smiling, a little nervously, into a camera held by a stranger. Neither of them quite sure what happens next. Both of them somehow trusting that it will. That photograph is the end of the rulebook. That photograph is the beginning of the rest of the century. And when you step back and look at the whole long, strange landscape of it, the pamphlets, the chaperones, the chalk lines drawn between officers and enlisted, the censors sitting at long wooden tables with their scissors and their black grease pencils, the V-girls pulled off train platforms in the middle of the night, the brides on the Queen Mary practicing the word cookie and the word drugstore and the word mother-in-law, the mothers at kitchen tables pressing onion skin letters into scrapbooks with trembling, careful hands. What you see mostly is people. Ordinary, stubborn, slightly ridiculous, endlessly lovable people. Girls in gingham dresses who learned the jitterbug. Boys in scratchy wool uniforms who learned how to ask someone to dance. Censors who quietly left the sweet parts in. Priests who signed the forms without reading too closely. Mothers who pretended not to hear the screen door at midnight. They were not heroes, most of them. They were not villains. They were clerks and waitresses and riveters and radio operators and farm boys and shop girls doing their very best inside a world that had, for a few long years, forgotten the difference between love and logistics. And it is worth saying gently that they were doing their best with what they had. The rulebook looks absurd to us now because we are standing on the far side of it with our phones and our freedoms and our unchaperoned lives. They did not have that vantage point. They had a war and a pamphlet and a mother and a hope. They were not foolish for following the rules. They were not wicked for breaking them. They were simply trying, as every generation tries, to love each other through the particular weather of their particular century. So tonight, as you lie in your warm bed with your phone on the nightstand and a message from someone you love, probably waiting, unread, on the lock screen. Maybe spare a quiet thought for the girl in 1943, standing in her mother's parlour. Hemline inspected, purse clutched, waiting for permission to go to a dance where a supervisor would tap her shoulder after the third song. And for the boy in the foxhole, reading a letter by flashlight, already half memorized, the paper softening at the creases. They did not know they were history. They only knew they were in love, and that the world just then was making it very complicated. Somewhere tonight, in a house you will never visit, a photograph sits on a mantel. Two young people, a little nervous, a little hopeful, staring into a camera held by a stranger in a year that is now very far away. The frame is dusty. The glass is smudged. No one has straightened it in a while. But it is still there. It is still standing. It is still quietly doing the job a photograph does, which is to remind a house that it began with two people who, somehow, against all of it, found each other. Let that be the last image. Let your breath slow. Let the blanket grow heavier. There is nothing to remember in the morning. The stories will keep. Good night. Sleep well. Sweet dreams.